Ryan Cole had done this exact run 47 times. Docking Bay 7, Vehari Station 9, standard supply transfer, drop off 3 crates of medical equipment, sign the digital manifest, grab the return confirmation, and be back on the ship in time for dinner. It was the most boring assignment in the entire rotation schedule, and he had specifically requested it because boring meant nothing goes wrong, and nothing goes wrong meant he could spend the evening playing cards with the crew instead of filing incident reports. He was 19 minutes ahead of schedule. Everything was fine. He pulled up the coordinate file on his wrist panel, the same file he had used a dozen times before, hit the transfer button to load it into the teleport pad, and stepped on. Standard procedure. Eyes forward, feet together, wait for the blue light. The blue light came, and then everything went sideways. Literally. The transport felt wrong immediately. That half-second of disorientation that happened during a jump was usually smooth and almost unnoticeable, like a single frame missing from a video. This one felt like someone had grabbed the universe, given a sharp twist, and then let go. His stomach lurched. His vision went white instead of the usual pale blue. And when the world snapped back into focus around him, he was already falling because he had materialized approximately 4 inches above floor level instead of on it. He hit the ground hard, face first, both hands shooting out just barely in time to keep his nose intact. The impact knocked the breath out of him. Something to his left made a sharp, high-pitched shattering sound that seemed to echo in a very large and very silent room. Ryan lay there for a second, palms flat on the floor, cheek pressed against cold stone, taking inventory. Nothing broken. Pride maybe, definitely pride. He pushed himself up slowly and looked to his left. A vase, or what used to be a vase. Tall, dark, decorated within gold patterns that looked incredibly detailed and incredibly old. Now in 4 pieces on the floor, next to a fallen stand that had probably held it for longer than Ryan had been alive. He stared at it for a moment with the specific kind of dread that arrives when you break something in a stranger's house and don't know yet how bad it actually is. Then he became aware of the silence. Not the normal background silence of an empty room. The heavy, loaded silence of a room full of people who had just stopped breathing at the same time. He raised his eyes slowly from the broken vase and looked up. 16 guards, standing in a precise formation around the edges of the largest, most ornate room he had ever seen in his life. Walls that stretched up further than made practical sense. Huge arched windows with light filtering through in long pale columns. Furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Floors so polished he could see a blurry reflection of his own confused face staring back up at him. Every single guard was pointing a weapon at him. They were tall, Vehari always were, with pale gray skin and the kind of perfectly still posture that came from years of training. They wore deep black armor with gold trim, and their expressions were somewhere between furious and genuinely baffled, which was probably the exact same expression Ryan was wearing from the other side. Nobody moved. Ryan slowly turned his head further to the right. At the far end of the room, seated in a high-backed chair that stopped just short of being a throne, was a woman watching him with an expression of such complete calm that it was somehow more intimidating than if she had been screaming. She was dressed in dark layered fabric, with silver at the collar and sleeves. Her posture was straight and unhurried. She looked like someone who had spent so many years being the most powerful person in any given room that she had simply stopped reacting to surprises the way normal people did. Ryan had no idea who she was yet. He would find out in approximately 8 seconds when one of the guards, in a shaking voice, said a title that translated roughly to Supreme Sovereign of the Vehari Empire and Ruler of 11 star systems. But in this particular moment, on his knees on the floor next to a pile of 300-year-old ceramic pieces, with 16 weapons aimed at various parts of his body, Ryan Cole did what he always did when things went completely off the rails. He took a breath. He looked around the room one more time just to confirm what he was seeing was real. Then he said, in a completely flat and honest voice, "This is not Base 7. The silence that followed was the loudest silence he had ever heard in his life. For about 4 full seconds, nobody in the room moved. 16 guards. 1 queen. 1 human cadet on his knees on the floor, next to the remains of a very old and very expensive vase. The only sound was a faint hum of the palace ventilation system and the distant noise of the city outside the tall windows. Then Ryan Cole did something that nobody in the room was prepared for. He stood up, not slowly and dramatically, not with his hands raised in surrender or his eyes wide with terror. He just pushed himself up off the floor the way a person gets up after tripping on a curb, a little awkward, mildly embarrassed, already moving on from it. He brushed the front of his uniform with both hands, checked his wrist panel out of habit to make sure it hadn't cracked in the fall, and then looked down at the broken vase on the floor beside him. He crouched back down and looked at the pieces more closely for a second. Then he stood back up and looked across the room at nobody in particular and said, "I'm really sorry about that. That looks old. I didn't land where I was supposed to, and I came down right next to it, and yeah, I'm sorry. That one's on me." Complete silence. Not the tense, loaded silence from before. Something different. More like the silence of an entire room of people simultaneously trying to process something that didn't fit any category they had prepared for. The guards hadn't lowered their weapons, but none of them had done anything else either. They were looking at each other in very brief sideways glances, the kind of looks that meant nobody was sure what the correct response was, and everyone was waiting for someone else to decide first. Counselor Vath, the senior advisor standing to the Queen's left, recovered first. He stepped forward slightly and drew himself up to his full height and said in a very formal and very deliberate voice that the cadet was standing in a restricted imperial chamber, that the penalty for unauthorized entry into the royal quarters was severe, and that the appropriate response at this moment was to kneel and wait for the Queen's judgment. Ryan looked at him. Then he looked around the room again in a brief, observational sweep, taking the scale of it, the guards, the architecture, the general situation. Then he looked back at Vath. "I understand," he said, in a tone that was respectful but not afraid. "I genuinely did not mean to be here. This was a teleport malfunction. I have no idea how it happened, and I'd like to figure that out as soon as possible. But I'm also not going to kneel on the floor, because I didn't do anything wrong on purpose, and kneeling feels like I'm saying I did." Vath stared at him. Several of the guards stared at him. At the far end of the room, Queen Seraph had not moved. She was still seated in the high-backed chair, with the same expression of absolute calm she'd been wearing since Ryan landed. She had ruled the Vehari Empire since she was 22 years old. She had sat in rooms with generals and diplomats and heads of state from species across the known systems. She had been feared, respected, negotiated with, and carefully managed by everyone who had ever stood in front of her. Nobody had ever just talked to her like that. Not defensively, not aggressively, not with calculated diplomacy or fear-driven caution. Just directly, like she was a person in the room who deserved a straight answer and was capable of handling one. She raised her right hand. The guards lowered their weapons. Vath closed his mouth. The room shifted from a breath away from an incident into something quieter and considerably more uncertain. Sareth looked at the human standing in the middle of her chamber floor for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching, not challenging her, just not looking away either. The way someone looks at another person when they have nothing to hide, and they know it. "You are not afraid," she said. Her voice carried easily across the room. Ryan tilted his head slightly. "I didn't say that," he said. "I'm a little afraid. 16 weapons is a lot of weapons. But I figure if you were going to do something about me, you'd have already done it. So..." Something moved across her expression, very briefly, very controlled. But it was there. "What is your name?" she said. "Ryan Cole," he said. "Cadet, Supply Corps, 3rd rotation. Assigned to Docking Bay 7 on Station 9. He paused. "Which I am clearly not in." "No," she agreed. "You are not." She studied him for another moment with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely trying to figure something out. In 15 years of ruling, she had developed a precise ability to read people quickly, to identify the angle they were working, the thing they wanted, the strategy underneath the surface behavior. It was a necessary skill when every person you met had a reason to perform in front of you. She could not find Ryan's angle, because he didn't have one. He was just standing there being exactly what he appeared to be, a tired, mildly rattled supply cadet who had landed in the wrong place and was handling it with a straightforwardness that she found genuinely difficult to categorize. Vath leaned toward her and said quietly and urgently that protocol required a detention procedure, that the chamber had been compromised, that the appropriate steps existed for exactly the situation, and they should be followed. Sarah didn't look at him. She was still looking at Ryan. "Sit down," she said, nodding toward the bench along the near wall. "We will determine what happened to your teleport." Ryan nodded once, picked up his pack on the floor, and sat down without any drama. He didn't thank her excessively. He didn't bow. He just sat down like a person who had been told to sit, and was doing exactly that. Vath looked like he had several things he wanted to say, and was being forced to swallow all of them. And Queen Seraph, for the first time in longer than she could easily recall, found herself genuinely curious about what was going to happen next. Not in a political sense, not in a strategic sense, but in the simple and unfamiliar way of a person who had just met someone they had expected and wanted to know more. It was, she thought, a very strange feeling. She had almost forgotten what it felt like. The palace technician delivered the news with the kind of expression people wear when they have to tell someone something they really don't want to say. The teleport relay had taken damage during the coordinate malfunction. Not catastrophic damage, nothing that couldn't be fixed, but the kind of damage that required careful recalibration and at least 8 hours of system cooling before it was safe to use again. Attempting to jump before that window would risk sending whoever stepped on the pad to a location that nobody wanted to think about too carefully. The technician finished his report, bowed to Queen Seraph, and waited. The room was very quiet. Ryan was sitting on a low bench near the wall with 2 guards flanking him, his pack at his feet, doing the mental calculation of how badly this was going to affect the supply schedule and whether his crew chief back on the ship was going to accept accidentally teleported into alien royalty's bedroom as a legitimate reason for delay. He decided probably yes, but it was going to be a long conversation. Sarah dismissed the technician. Then she looked at her senior advisor, a tall, thin man named Counselor Vath, who had been standing at her left shoulder since Ryan arrived, visibly unhappy about every single development of the past 2 hours. He was already drawing breath to suggest a detention option. The palace had perfectly adequate holding rooms. Clean, secure, standard procedure for exactly this kind of situation. Sarah raised one hand slightly, and he stopped. "He stays here," she said. The look on Vath's face was remarkable. Ryan caught it from across the room and filed it away, because it was genuinely impressive how much alarm a person could communicate without actually moving their face very much. 2 guards were repositioned to the interior of the chamber. The doors were secured. And just like that, Ryan Cole from a small town in Colorado was spending the night in the private royal chamber of the Vehari Queen, which was not something any career counselor had ever suggested as a possible outcome of joining the supply corps. For the first hour, it was mostly quiet. Sarah sat at the long table near the central window and worked through what appeared to be documents or reports of some kind. Ryan sat where he'd been told to sit and didn't push anything. He was not a complicated person when it came to reading situations, and this one was clear enough. Stay calm, stay quiet, don't break anything else, let the night pass. But then she set down whatever she was reading and looked at him directly. "You're not frightened," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Ryan thought about it honestly. "A little," he said, "but you haven't done anything yet, so I figure I'm okay for now." She studied him for a moment like he was something she was trying to classify. Every person who has ever entered this chamber without permission has either begged or gone silent with fear. You have done neither. "Begging doesn't really fix anything," Ryan said, "and being quiet seemed rude since you're clearly aware I'm here." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile. More like the face someone makes when they encounter something they weren't prepared for. "Ask your question," she said. "You've been sitting there forming one for the last 20 minutes. He hadn't realized it was that obvious. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "Being in this room. It's enormous, and there's nothing comfortable in it. Everything in here looks like it's meant to be looked at, not actually used." She was quiet for a moment. "I have never been asked that." "Doesn't mean it's not worth asking," he said. And somehow, without either of them planning it, the conversation just continued from there. She mentioned at one point, not as a complaint, just as a passing observation, that she hadn't eaten since early morning. The schedule had been full. It happened sometimes. Ryan reached into his pack without a word, pulled out a standard-issue food ration bar, and slid across the table toward her. Plain, practical, the kind of thing that tasted like compressed cardboard but got the job done. She looked at it for a second, then she picked it up. Her advisor, still hovering near the far wall, looked like he was experiencing some kind of internal crisis at the sight of the Queen of 11 star systems eating a human field ration at her own table. The night moved slowly. Ryan asked her questions the way he asked everyone questions, straightforwardly, without ceremony, like she was just a person in a room and not someone who controlled the fate of billions. What did she actually enjoy? When had she last left the palace? Did she choose any of this, or was it chosen for her before she was old enough to have an opinion? She answered, slowly at first, then more easily. Her voice lost the formal flatness it had carried since he arrived and became something more natural underneath. She had opinions, real ones, about the inefficiency of the court structure, about the outer system she had never visited, about the gap between what her advisors told her and what she suspected was actually true. Nobody talked to her like this. Nobody asked. The people around her managed her, carefully, professionally, and completely. Every conversation she had was pre-shaped before it reached her. Every briefing was edited. Every visit was arranged. The world she saw every day was a curated version of itself built specifically for her consumption, and she had known that for years without ever being able to do anything about it. Ryan didn't know any of that. He was just talking. By 11, he was leaning back in the chair with his arms folded, still listening to her describe a trade dispute in the outer corridor that had been ongoing for 3 years. By midnight, he was asleep. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way tired people fall asleep when they've been up since before dawn and have had a genuinely exhausting day. His head tilted to the side. His breathing slowed. Sarah stopped mid-sentence. She looked at him. He was just asleep. That was all. Completely unremarkable in every way. She sat across from him in the stillness of the chamber for a long time after that. The guards were quiet at the walls. The palace was settled into its night silence. And she sat there with the wrapper from a human food ration on the table in front of her and thought about the fact that this had been the first real conversation she'd had in years. Not a managed one. Not a political one. Not one where the other person was carefully aware of every word they chose and what reaction it might produce. Just a real one, with a person who had no reason to impress her and hadn't tried to. She looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she looked back at Ryan, asleep in the chair, and thought, quietly and without saying out loud to anyone, that this had been the strangest and most honest evening she had experienced in a very long time. Ryan woke up just before dawn. For about 3 seconds, he had no idea where he was. Then the enormity of the room came back into focus. The guards at the walls, the pale light coming to the tall windows, and the Queen of 11 star systems sitting across the table from him, reading documents in complete silence. Memory returned fast after that. He straightened up in the chair, cleared his throat quietly, and said, "Sorry, I don't usually fall asleep on people." Seraph looked up. "You were tired," she said simply, like it was just a fact and not something that required any further commentary. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked out the window. The sky outside was shifting from dark to that deep blue that happened in the last hour before actual sunrise. He had maybe 3 hours before the teleport was cleared for use. He reached into his pack, found the last ration bar, broke it in half without thinking about it, and slid one half across the table. She took it, again without making a thing of it. They sat like that for a moment in the early quiet, and then Ryan asked her what she was reading. She told him. A report from the outer corridor about shipping delays affecting 3 colony stations in the Verith region. Standard administrative document. The kind of thing that passed through her desk regularly. Ryan was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I've been to Verith. Did the run there 4 times last cycle." She looked at him. The report indicates minor logistical disruption. Supply delays of 2 to 3 weeks. The report's being kind, Ryan said, not with any edge in his voice. Just a flat, plain tone of someone correcting a small error. Station 7 out there has been running on about 60% of its required medical supply for the better part of 4 months. The delays aren't 2 weeks. They're ongoing. The station coordinator files requests, and they move slowly through the system, and by the time anything get approved, the situation has already gotten worse. Sarah set the document down. "You've seen this yourself," she said. "I delivered to them," he said. "Talked to the crew chief there. Nice woman. Been running that station for 11 years. She showed me the request logs once, not complaining, just explaining why she needed the delivery prioritized. The logs went back 8 months. Responses were slow across the board. He wasn't angry about it. He said it the way you describe traffic on a road you drive every day. Matter of fact, slightly tired of it, but not surprised. That was somehow what made it land harder than if he'd been furious." Sarah was quiet. She was looking at the document in front of her differently now. "Tell me about the other systems," she said. So he did. He talked about the Drenali border colonies, where 3 small settlements shared a single medical station because of funding to build separate facilities had been approved 4 years ago and then quietly stalled somewhere in the administrative process. He talked about Station 12 in the Outer Ring, where the water filtration system had been operating on a temporary patch for going on 2 years because the replacement parts kept getting delayed, and the people living there had just adapted to it, because what else do you do? He talked about the families he had met during overnight holds. Supply runs sometimes meant waiting out a weather event or a system check, and you ended up sharing meals with the locals and hearing things. A father who had been waiting 14 months for a response to a resettlement application. Kids growing up on stations that didn't have enough educational resources because the allocation models used population data that was 3 years out of date. None of it was dramatic. He wasn't presenting a case or building an argument. He was just describing things he'd seen with his own eyes the way you describe anything you've personally experienced. In plain language with specific details, and no particular agenda behind it. That was what made it so different from everything else Sarah had heard. Every briefing she received had been shaped before it reached her. Not dishonestly necessarily. Her advisors weren't lying to her, but they were managing her, deciding what level of detail was appropriate, framing problems in the context of what solutions were already available, so she wouldn't worry about things that couldn't immediately be fixed, smoothing the edges, presenting the version of her empire that was easiest to govern from a distance. It was efficient, it was professional, and it meant she had been sitting at the center of 11 star systems for 15 years without ever really seeing most of them. Counselor Vath had arrived at the chamber doors an hour after sunrise for his morning briefing, and had been standing near the wall for the past 30 minutes. He had the particular stillness of someone who was listening carefully to every word being said, and didn't like most of them. Ryan had clocked him when he came in, but it hadn't changed anything about the way he was talking. There was nothing to manage. He was just describing his job. At one point, Seraph asked why none of this appeared in the reports that came through official channels. Ryan thought about it honestly. Probably because the people writing the reports are trying to solve the problem at the same time as reporting it, he said. So they soften it a little while they work on a fix. Makes sense from their side. But it means you're always getting the version where someone's already decided what's actionable, not the raw version. And the raw version, she said slowly, is what you've been describing. I'm just telling you what I saw, he said. I'm a supply cadet. I don't have any stake in how you take it. She nodded once, very slightly. The kind of nod that wasn't agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The kind that meant something had landed somewhere it wasn't going to move from. Vath shifted his weight near the wall. Ryan noticed, but didn't say anything. Sarah picked up the Verith report again and read it through a second time. It looked different now, not because the words had changed, because she was reading them with a picture in her head that hadn't been there before. A real one, made of actual details from an actual person who had stood in those stations and talked to the people living in them. She set it down again. How many systems have you run supplies through? She asked. 14 in the last 2 years, Ryan said, give or take. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him steadily. Then keep talking, she said. And he did, for another full hour, while the sun came all the way up outside the tall windows and the palace began to wake around them. Ryan Cole described the outer edges of her empire to the woman who ruled it. Plainly, honestly, and without anyone managing a single word of it. The technician confirmed the repairs at 9:30 in the morning. System fully recalibrated. Relay stable. Coordinates verified. Everything exactly as it should have been the day before, when none of this had happened yet. He delivered the news to Counselor Vath, who delivered it to the chamber with the barely contained relief of a man who had spent the entire night waiting for this specific moment. Ryan was sitting at the table finishing the last of the water from his pack when he heard. He nodded, started gathering his things, and did a quick mental check of everything he still needed to do that day. The supply manifest was still sitting in his pocket and signed. The 3 crates were presumably still sitting on the original pad at Base 7. His crew chief had sent 4 messages overnight that ranged in tone from mildly concerned to quietly furious. There was a lot to deal with. He stood up, swung his pack over one shoulder, and turned to face the room. Sareth was standing near the window. She had been there for the past 20 minutes, looking out at the city below with the particular stillness of someone doing their thinking out loud inside their own head. She turned when he moved. Ryan crossed the room toward her. Vath was already positioning himself slightly forward, ready to step in, ready to manage whatever this last interaction was going to be and make sure it concluded efficiently and without any further disruption to morning schedule. Ryan stopped a few feet away from her and said, "I want to say thank you for not throwing me in a cell. Or worse. You didn't have to handle it the way you did, and I know that. It was completely sincere. No performance in it, no calculation. Just a person acknowledging something honestly before they left." Vath opened his mouth. Sareth raised her hand slightly without looking at him, and he closed it again. "The transport pad is this way," she said. She walked him there herself. The transport room was 2 corridors from the royal chamber, a short walk through a part of the palace that most people never saw the inside of. Vath followed at a distance, as did 2 guards. But Sareth walked alongside Ryan at an unhurried pace. Not ahead of him, not behind. Just beside him the way you walk with someone you've been talking to. The other staff they passed in the corridor stopped and stared. Not rudely, just with a wide-eyed look of people witnessing something that had no precedent in their professional experience. A senior attendant near the east corridor doorway actually forgot to bow until her colleague nudged her. Nobody could remember the last time the Queen had walked a visitor to the transport pad. There were people working in the palace who had been there for 30 years and were quietly certain it had never happened at all. They reached the transport room. The pad was active. Coordinates already loaded and verified twice by the technician, who was standing to the side, looking like he very much wanted to be somewhere else, but had been told to remain present for confirmation. Ryan stepped up to the edge of the pad and checked his wrist panel one more time. Then he turned back around. Sarah was standing a few feet away with her hands folded in front of her and an expression that was hard to read, controlled and composed on the surface, the way it always was, but with something quieter underneath that hadn't been there when he first landed face first on her chamber floor roughly 14 hours ago. "I have a question," she said. "Yeah," Ryan said. "Yesterday, when you stood up, when you chose not to kneel." She paused. "You said you were afraid, but you didn't act afraid. I want to understand why." He thought about it, not quickly, not with prepared answer, but the way he thought about most things, genuinely, from the inside out, taking it seriously because she'd asked seriously. "I think," he said slowly, "because you seem tired more than anything else. And I've noticed that people who are mostly tired don't usually want to make things worse. They just want something to be straightforward for once." He paused. "You were sitting in that big empty room, and everybody in it was scared of you and performing for you, and I just thought, that looks exhausting. So I figured talking to you like a normal person was probably more useful than making it more complicated than it already was." Sareth was quiet for a moment. "Nobody has ever described me as tired," she said. "I don't mean it as an insult," he said. "I just mean you're carrying a lot. It shows. Not weakness. Just weight." She looked at him steadily, and for just a moment something in her expression shifted. Not much, not dramatically, but enough. The kind of shift that happens when someone says out loud a thing you have never been able to say about yourself, and it turns out to be exactly true. "You should check your coordinates more carefully," she said. "Twice from now on," he agreed. "Every time." He stepped onto the pad. The technician ran the final confirmation. The system hummed to life. Ryan looked back at her one last time. He raised one hand in a small, simple wave. Not a bow, not a formal gesture. Just a wave. The kind you give someone at the end of an ordinary day. Then the light took him, and he was gone. The room was very quiet. Sarah stood on the empty platform and looked at the space where he had been standing. The hum of the system faded. The technician made himself very still near the wall. The two guards looked straight ahead. Vath was behind her, already preparing to speak, already organizing the agenda for the rest of the day, already moving toward putting last night into a compartment that could be managed and minimized and eventually forgotten. She didn't move for a long moment. She was thinking about 14 stations, about request logs 8 months deep, about a crew chief on Varith who had been doing her job for 11 years and filing reports into a system that processed them slowly while the people around her made do, about the gap between the version of her empire she received every morning in carefully prepared briefings and the version that actually existed in the outer corridors where supply cadets made overnight stops and talked to people. She was thinking about what it felt like to have a conversation that nobody had arranged in advance. She turned around. Vath was ready with the morning schedule, the court agenda, the list of briefings and audiences and decisions requiring her attention, everything organized and managed and prepared the way it always was. "Cancel the morning briefings," she said as she walked past him. He blinked. "Your Majesty." "Call an open court session," she said. "Full attendance. Every regional advisor, not just the senior counsel. I want the outer system representatives in the room." She paused at the doorway. "And I want the actual reports, not the summaries. The original documents before their process." Vath stood very still. "An open session hasn't been called in 6 years, she said. "I know." She walked back through the corridor toward the royal chamber. The staff she passed moved aside and watched her go with expressions ranging from surprise to stunned to quietly excited in the way people get when something long stuck finally starts to move. She sat down at her table. The morning light was coming fully through the windows now, wide and clear across the polished floor. She pulled the Varith report toward her, the real one, the one Ryan had described as the managed version, and set it to the side to be replaced with the original. Then she looked at the empty chair across the table, the one where a supply cadet from Colorado had fallen asleep before midnight, and talked to her like a person for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. She had spent 15 years at the center of an empire being seen as untouchable, as distant, as something closer to a symbol than a person, and it had happened so gradually that she hadn't noticed the cost of it until a human with a corrupted coordinate file landed on her floor and treated her, without any particular effort or intention, like someone worth being honest with. He hadn't changed everything. One conversation doesn't do that, but something had shifted, quietly and permanently. The way foundations move, not visible on the surface, but solid underneath. She could feel it in the way she was reading the report in front of her, in the questions she was already forming, in the fact that for the first time in years, she was genuinely curious about the answers. Outside, the city carried on the way cities do, and somewhere in the middle distance, a supply ship received a very confused and very relieved cadet back aboard, and the crew chief stood in the docking bay with 4 unread messages on her communicator and an expression that suggested the explanation was going to have to be exceptionally good. Ryan sat down in the debrief room, folded his hands on the table, and figured he'd start from the beginning,